This webinar series is presented by members of the International Association of Peer Supporters with the generous assistance of Optum, without whom this series would not be possible. N.A.P.S is solely responsible for the content of the webinar. I am the moderator for this webinar. My name is Peter Ashenden. I'm the Director of Consumer Affairs for Optum Health Behavioral Solutions, and here's the way to get in touch with me if you need to. So at this time, what I'd like to do is introduce I'm going to introduce one of our speakers, and that's Sally Zinman. I've had the pleasure of knowing Sally now for Sally, I think we've known each other well over 20 years.
Right.
She is a tireless advocate who has really been changing the face of how mental health services are being offered, not only in California, but nationally. So I want to welcome Sally to our presentation. And at this point, Sally, do you want to take over?
I would love to. Thank you. I'm sorry that it took me so long to get my voice on. So I first want to do an overview of what you're going to be watching and hearing today. The purpose of this whole webinar is to learn about the history of our movement in order to rededicate ourselves to its core values and inform our work. The learning objectives for both parts are described.
Sally, I'm sorry. Don't forget to give me the cue of next slide when you're ready to move on, please.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Describe the core principles of our ConsumerSurvivor movement. Recognize the transition and challenges in moving from grassroots militant action to providing funded mental health services. Explain the major progressive effect and changes that the ConsumerSurvivor movement has made in the mental health system, and recognize the influence of history on art and of art on history. So you can go to the next slide. So I want to talk about what it was like in the 1960s and 70s, the environment, the landscape from which our modern consumer survivor ex-patient peer movement began. There were huge social change movements in the 1960s and 70s. The African American, women, gay, people with physical disabilities, it was a time of great excitement and almost revolution in our country. And for decades, we, mental patients, which is what the name we were called then, were denied our basic civil rights, suffered huge systematic inhumane treatment in hospitals. We spent lifetimes in hospitals, died in hospitals. But now there were new laws limiting involuntary commitment, and the new big state hospitals were being shut down and people were releasing. So you can just put those two things together, big revolutionary movements we were getting out of the hospitals for the first time. Next slide. Anecdotally, I have never seen this written except I've written it, is I know from people that I know that people started meeting with each other outside of the hospital. If you remember, in the hospital, there was always staff around. They started sharing their treatments, their abusive treatments. They started validating each other's feelings. The first self-help groups or support groups among ourselves. And they were talking about the need for independent living in the community. And out of these small groups, a new civil rights movement was born. And it was really based on the desire for personal freedom, for radical system change. And in my opinion, it was and still is a liberation movement. Go to the next slide. There are things about the landscape that are important to know. Is one, we talk about nothing about us without us. Everything was about us without us. We were not only at the table, we were not even in the room. So obviously we were on streets and with placards because that's what you do when you're not at the table and not at the room. And another big element of that time is that once you were diagnosed, you were considered mentally ill for the rest of your life with a downward trajectory. So it was a chronic people the culture of what mental illness was chronicity, and the best that you could expect was maintenance. Those two things are important to remember as I'm speaking, because they radically change in the years as the years unfold. Madness Network News was a newspaper that united us. It was our one means of communication. But in terms of the landscape, this was also a time before the internet. So this is how we communicated. It was supposedly quarterly, but it actually was put out when people got around to being able to put it out. It's that casual, but this is what united us. And you can look at the cover and see how radical it was. To hell with their profits, stop forced drugging, dangerous psychiatrists released. Next slide. In the beginning, the 1970s were really a time of finding each other, of realizing that we were not alone, of very militant groups and actions, of self and group education, of defining our core values, of finding and growing our voice out of the anger and hurt bred by the oppression of the mental health system, and of separatism as a means of empowering ourselves. And separatism is not a bad thing. I mean, it's not the end game, but for groups that have been hurt, it's a way of getting to the end game, of meeting just with people who have shared your own experience and feeling empowered so you can go back to the world as an equal. Next slide. The process, by that I mean it's how we operated. The groups were totally autonomous because they believed in local control. Not many across the country, mostly on the East Coast and the West Coast, and one or two in between. Took no money from the mental health system. In fact, it didn't take money because it was a social, it was civil rights and social change, and we were doing this because of our conscience. Very, very separatist. We were not outreaching. And no major outreach. I mean, we even not only separatists from people who were not people who had experienced the hospitals and involuntary treatment, but also we didn't do a lot of outreach even among ourselves. It was a lot of people talking to each other for probably a decade or more. Next slide. The principles were very clear then. They are to me today, and to me there is a strand from then to now that is very, very clear. It was all was within the context of the civil rights movement for people diagnosed with mental illness. We're totally against forced treatment, against inhumane treatment, medications, ECT, lobotomy, seclusion and restraint. We had a word called sanism, which is what you call in the language of the time, which is racism, feminism, sexism, which today we call stigma and discrimination, which has been a fight of ours forever. Very anti-medical model, verging on anti-psychiatry. Some people would say it was anti-psychiatry. I think it was more about choice. And the emerging concept of mental patient-run alternatives to the mental health system, consumer-run programs. That's another thing about the landscape. They did not exist. And peer support in an organized way, that did not exist. And overarching all was to be involved in every aspect of the mental health system, because this was a system that was about us without us. The activities of this period, very, very political militant activism, as I said. I mean, if you're not inside the doors, if you're not at the table, you're outside with placards. You're doing in-your-face demonstrations. You're trying to get yourself known and getting people to know that you're important and your voice is important. It's really also a time of developing and defining our values and positions. I mean, we came together mostly at campgrounds and college campuses. Our conferences were unfunded. We had a conference called the Annual Conference on Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression. You could hear the militancy of the names. And in those campgrounds, we sat around and brainstormed these ideas of consumer-run programs, our peer support. We were developing our values and our positions. Madness Network News, as you saw the picture, was our news vehicle for communication. As I said, there were small groups, mostly on the two coasts, but listen to the names: Network Against Psychiatric Assault, Insane Liberation Front, Mental Patient Liberation Front. I mean, they're vastly different than the names today of, I'm thinking of those in California, Heart and Soul, or our national organization, National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery, Alameda County Network of Mental Health Clients, that even the names express the difference in the times. We mostly called ourselves psychiatric inmates because we had felt we were inmates, like inmates are in jail. We were inmates in the mental health system, and the majority of us at hospitals. It was a time of great self and group information and education. Something else about the time, nobody had explained to us or given us information about what the treatments, quote, they were using, the medications they were using. So we began educating ourselves. We began writing books and manuals about the psychiatric drugs and what they were and what their side effects were and what your rights were in different states, because we didn't have that information, so we created it ourselves. And as I said, lots of support and consciousness-raising groups, probably the first sort of informal groups of mental patients getting together and offering each other support. Next page. The landmark book that I wish all of you would read, maybe you have, and it's so significant. I know it's like from 1978, it's dated, but I've looked at it off and on and recently, and there's things that are so pertinent to today, by someone named Judy Chamberlain, called On Her Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. She defines consumer-run programs and peer support in a way that we might not today, with different words, but it is exactly the same as today. Next slide. It's a demonstration against the American Psychiatric Association. So the kind of things that we did. This was from a page of the cover of Madness Network News. And at that particular demonstration, we had chained ourselves to each other in front of the APA's convention hall where they were having a convention, and vowed that we would stay the whole night. They were smart and just went in other doors. But if you look at this cover, you can see how radical we were. There was a person among us with a long pole and changed the billboard describing the convention. So instead of Welcome American Psychiatric Association, she put Welcome A Psychiatric Ass CIA. That's sort of an example of how in your face and radical and militant we were. But you have to be, if you're not at the table, that's what you have to do to get to the table. Next slide. The 1980s were a huge transition, big changes that really changed the direction of our movement. It was part of growth. Howie the Harp was, in my mind, one of probably our father, one of our great leaders. And I hope that many of you have known him. It's important to me that people know those names in the way that other movements know the names of their great leaders, because he was one of our great leaders. As I said, the 1980s were really a transitional time. We made major movement decisions that left many of the more purest activists behind. We began re-entering the world that so had hurt us. It was a time of significant founding endeavors, of significant things that had been our founding activities ended, but new ventures began. And it was also the beginning of some of the implementation of some of our vision, of some of the things that we had conceptualized, transitioning from words to deeds, the first drop-in centers, the things that we had sat in those campgrounds and visualized began to start happening, or we began to make them happen. So if there were processes or how this was organized, how it was done in the 1980s, mainstreaming was major. We began to outreach to the thousands and thousands of consumers that never heard of a mental patient liberation movement. Centralizing instead of local autonomous groups, or in addition to them, we began having state networks. The California Network of Mental Health Clients was formed in 1983. It was the first statewide organization. It's probably the biggest issue, the biggest issue that tore us apart and that we argued about was taking money from the mental health system. It was very controversial. You need money to move from words to deeds and to implement. To open up a drop-in center, you need money to pay for the rent. To serve your peers in a consistent way. It is nice to help somebody get housing as a volunteer, to help them with their Social Security, but to do it consistently, you have to start paying people. So it was very, very hotly debated. And many people left our movement when we began taking money from the mental health system. Remember, previously the mental health system was our enemy, and we needed money to start operating, to start implementing our ideals and our visions. And the more progressive mental health system, including the Center for Mental Health Services, the federal government, was offering it to us. And there was a decision to move forward and go forward with implementing our vision. We began to collaborate with other organizations, not just consumers. Began the sort of, I would call it the reentry process. Re-entering the world. Next slide. As I said, that we began to see the beginning of the sort of foundation of what you see today, of drop-in centers. You can see the list of the drop-in centers that began in 1983 and 85 and 86. The federal government Community Support Program, NIMH, funded ConsumerSurvivor programs. Actually, they funded 13 consumer demonstration projects, beginning of statewide organizations. Next slide. But it was also the discontinuation of the things that had organized us for almost 10 years or more. Madness Network News, I think, was published for the last time in 1986. It was a decline of the radical militant groups, although there are still militant groups, but as a movement, it was declined there was a decline of these groups. The International Conference on Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression, its last conference was in 1985, and the first National Alternatives Conference was in 1985. That is not a coincidence. The new was replacing the old, or the old had built our movement to the point of time where it could enter into different ways of organizing and communicating with each other. There were big gains in rights protections and legislation. I think Protection Advocacy Incorporated was formed near the end of the 1980s. We were beginning to walk inside and consider social change from the inside as well as the outside. And more consumers were sitting on decision-making bodies. So it was sort of just like the beginning of the things that we had envisioned, the beginning of implementing them. Next slide. And I'm now going to sort of jump like 20 or 30 years. Next slide. Getting what we wanted. So we wanted these things. We fought for them. We protested for them. In the 80s, we began doing them and made big decisions to be able to do them, and lost some of our great leaders in terms of not wanting to be part of this movement anymore. In my opinion, in the next 20 or 30 years, I'm going from like 1990, 2000 up to now, we have been able to get what we wanted to a large extent. There's still a lot of work to be done. I want to say that this presentation is very positive. It's what we've come from and where we've gone. We've gone a long way, baby. That does not mean there are not still problems and barriers. And in fact, today, some of the biggest threats to our freedom and self-determination that I've seen in decades. But that's not what I'm concentrating in this presentation. I believe our basic values remain the same, or at least for me they remain the same. I think we just rephrase them. We had huge growth in consumer-run programs, employment, educational opportunities, and attitudes about maintenance and chronicity began to change. The word in the 1980s, 1990s, started talking about recovery. There's a whole new conceptual way of describing what happens when you are diagnosed with mental illness, that you can recover, that it is not chronic, that it's not a diagnosis for life. Next page. For me, as I said, principles remain the same. And I think principles are so important. That's why I emphasize them in the presentation. So instead of being against forced treatment, I am for self-determination and choice, for rights protections, for stigma and discrimination reduction. Instead of being anti-medical model, really, I think what we were saying, that we wanted services to respond to the multiple needs of people with friends, housing, jobs, support. We're envisioning and we're self-help, peer support programs are happening. It's been a principle of ours right from the beginning. And involvement in every aspect of the mental health system. Nothing about us without us, and encompassing all of these is the concept of recovery. We always knew we got better. We were sitting around talking to each other at campgrounds, and we knew we got better, but we had to start convincing the world that there's something called recovery. Next slide. Where we have come. Well, employment. In addition, people don't realize that the first employers of people with mental health issues were consumer-run programs, because that's who we hired. But now we're employed in the mental health system. We have mental health management level jobs, offices of consumer affairs. And that's sort of a very interesting thing, because years ago in the 1970s and 80s, we would not have had employment in the mental health system as a goal. The mental health system was an enemy, and we think, why would you want to work there? But that's changed. Huge growth in consumer-run peer support programs. We have now 3 technical assistance centers that just provide support and technical assistance for us. Years ago, you could put on one page in Memphis Network News the consumer-run programs that existed. Incorporation of consumer-run peer support into the system, such as recovery wellness centers, peer support specialists, peer certification, Medi-Cal-funded peer support. To me, the recovery wellness centers are the old drop-in centers. That's the base. That's the model. Peer certification is implemented in 34 states, and I'm sad to say California is not one of them, but we're trying to change that in the next few years. Next slide. There are multiple training opportunities, including consumer-developed trainings. Years ago, we went to other people's trainings. Now we have our own. A prime example is Mariel and Copeland and RAP. Really meaningful consumer involvement at most levels of the mental health system. We partner with other constituency groups now, not only in the mental health world, but in the worlds that are related to mental health. There's research on consumer-run programs and peer support, and the emergence of consumer researchers. Jean Campbell, as an example, the Wellbeing Project was probably one of the first consumer-led research projects in the 1980s. And we work with policymakers to legislate and make change policy. Next slide. There are right now new consumer-driven models such as peer-run respite centers that are growing throughout the country, and self-directed care. I'm most excited looking back to the 70s and the 80s and looking at the movement today of how diverse and inclusive it is. It looks different, which is it always should have and does now. Creation of national organizations that represent our interests. The National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery, a national advocacy voice for consumer survivors, and your International Association of Peer Supporters that promotes the use of peer support services worldwide. What I'm talking about is really we've learned to do effective advocacy from the inside. Both inside and outside advocacy are important, but now we've moved to inside advocacy. We know how to do that. We know how to walk the halls. Next slide. This was a theme of one of our conferences in California, and I think client leadership is real transformation. So I want to jump to the changes we've made, next slide, the real cultural change that we've made in 40 years. I'm talking about 40 years or more. You can see the evidence of system culture change as a result of our involvement throughout the mental health system and throughout the country. my example in California, there's a Mental Health Services Act that was a ballot, a proposition, a huge transition in our mental health laws, and it embedded in it explicitly or implicitly is voluntary services, promotion of self-help peer support, involvement of consumers at all levels, involvement of consumers as part of and in the training of the mental health workforce, and the promotion of recovery as a goal. Next slide. The concept of recovery it was inspired by consumers, and Bill Anthony, who sort of promoted it and put it on the map, attributes it to consumers. Recovery, remember I talked about in the very beginning to think of these two concepts I was talking about. Recovery replaces maintenance as the goal for people diagnosed with mental illness. That is so significant. There has been this whole culture shift from maintenance, from the best you could imagine was that you will be mentally ill the rest of your life, and maybe if you got out of a hospital, live in a boarding care home. The President's New Freedom Commission in July 2003, in its mission statement, right in the beginning of its major report, said we envision a future when everyone with a mental illness will recover. Consumers have initiated new genres of services. Consumer-run programs and peer support are essential in most mental health systems, and they're designated as best practices. I mean, we would never have imagined that sitting around campgrounds and talking about the idea of running our own programs and having formal peer support meetings. So there have been enormous changes. Next slide. I think it's all about liberation. And I know for myself, my initial goal was to advocate for other people, to liberate other people. Then it wasn't too long that I realized that in that very process, I was really advocating for each other. I was really freeing myself. I was really advocating for myself. I was getting better. I was feeling better about myself. I was redefining myself. And as a movement, we did that too. And then I had this final understanding that we were also liberating the system. We were making it better for everyone that works in the mental health system to work there. It's a liberating and healing environment for everybody. Next slide. So, I can look back 40 years sort of like a plane flying over Earth. And I know from day to day, when you're in the trenches, it's hard, and you think, oh my God, it's 2 steps forward and 3 steps backwards. But I have seen enormous changes, and I have that kind of faith in the future that we will make the same kind of changes and achievements. The scope of our achievements of the past is really an indicator of the possibilities for our future. So next slides just talk about the acknowledgements, because this really history of the movement has come from so many people. It's come from thousands and thousands of advocates. It's really not mine. It was shaped by everybody. And my contact information, the California Association of Mental Health Peer-run Organizations. So with that, Peter, I think you're going to introduce Gayle.
I believe I am. We're going to hold off on questions right now. And what I'd like to do is introduce Gayle Bluebird. Gayle, I've had the pleasure of also knowing for a significant period of time as advocates that are known nationally and trying to take and change the landscape of how mental health services are being offered. And Gayle certainly has been a very, very creative person in dealing with changing the system, advocating for us, and making sure that our services are truly person-centered and person-directed. So without any further ado, I'd like to take and introduce Gayle Bluebird.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Rita and Sally, for an excellent presentation. We've done this before. I think this was really, really done well, and as always. And so I thank you, Sally. And I thank you for everybody that helped to organize this webinar, which I think is very important. Sally and I both think that the history of our movement is an extremely important and sometimes forgotten forgotten and not included in some of our new experiences and training experiences. So next. Okay, the title of my presentation is Arts Illustrating and Making History. It's so named because of the different ways in which art was used or expressed at different points during the development of our consumer, quote, survivor or even liberation movement. And in the early stages, art was used to express outrage against psychiatric abuse, outrage against the system, and as Sally pointed out, sometimes even rejecting the whole idea of psychiatry or the medical model. Art had no boundaries. In one of the signs above, which is one of my favorites, the words, "We'd rather be mad with the truth than sane with lies." At a later time, art was used as a means of exploring personal issues of trauma or their own personal issues, or some of the atrocities in the mental health system or the abuses in the mental health system. Okay, next. So the first thing I'm going to do is to talk about the 70s, just very briefly, because I really want to also talk about some of the artists that are making a difference in our movement today. But in the beginnings, art was used in the newsletters that Sally described, Memphis Network News. Frequently, they were some of the depictions were shown there. We had posters that were decorated or designed in our demonstrations, which were always very artistic. The newsletters, chants, songs. Jeannie Matulis was a songwriter at that time who was now an attorney. We had music and we had poetry. Okay, next. This is a picture of our cover of Memphis Network News that was in 1977, I believe. And as Sally pointed out, it was published up until 1986 when our movement changed. The cover in this issue was done by Howie who was very much a part of our early movement. Also interesting, I like the byline, which was of Memphis Network News, which was all that fits, that's news to print, and which I thought was kind of creative. In this illustration, and I'm not going to spend too much time, but if you could come back to it, there are women that are in despair, some of them that are very angry, but there was no way for them to break through the prison of psychiatry or the prison of the institution that they were in, long hallway, a little bit of light, but no way for them to access the outside. Tanya now works for a disability research organization and still is supportive, but is not directly involved in our movement. Next. Okay, well, here's another cover that Sally already talked about. I believe she might have mentioned the fact that we had a sleep-in at then Governor Jerry Brown's office in California, who I think is now, again, the governor. On the right-hand side, Mayor Frank to the right died just this last year. To his left is Wade Hudson. Below Wade is myself, kind of looking to the side. I consider this my favorite photograph. For 30 days, people slept in at the governor's office protesting things like deaths in the institutions, unpaid labor, and other types of abuses, which were brought to the attention of the governor. Okay, next. Howie the Harp. Howie was not only what we might call our father of our movement, but for those of us that were artists, he was a folk hero. He was the MC to many of our alternative talent shows. He called us crazy folk, which I thought was creative, which he said are the most talented people in the galaxy. Instead of diagnosing, locking up, and treating us, the world should recognize our true worth and support our talents, creativity, and sensitivity. Howie carried a harmonica with him everywhere to make music, mediate conflict, and create peace. Next. In the 1980s, we saw a transition with the arts. Many more, we had talent shows at alternatives, but also at other conferences. In drop-in centers, art was always present. Self-help research projects, which I'm going to talk about, was mentioned. Individual artists started to be prominently known, and theater groups at that time were popular. Next. The painting is one done by Campbell, most known for being the first person to do a research project in 1987 by and for mental health clients. It was done in California, in which 500 persons were interviewed. Interesting that 61% stated that creativity was essential to their health well-being. 24% stated that they lacked creativity in their lives. But Jean, probably most people don't know that she's also a very talented artist. In the painting that she did on the right is called Alone and Waiting. There's a person, I always think of it as also representing our movement or people in our movement who are often very lonely, without outside resources, reading a book, and again, sometimes not a way to connect with other people. Jean is a PhD and received a full partnership professorship in 2010 and worked on the COS project, or was the leader of it, Consumer Operated Service Programs, which was a research project. Next. This is just a pictorial or collage of some of the performers that performed in our early alternatives conferences. I could mention a lot of them. I'm going to mention a few. In the center is Bonnie Shell, who started one of the early drop-in centers, I think after the ones named by Sally, in Santa Cruz, California. To her left is oh gosh, I can't think of her name all of a sudden. Anyway, she was one that. No, well, Cookie Grant is in this picture also, and I'm going to mention her. She's to the right of Bonnie in this picture, and to the left is Frances. Oh, anyway, she was one of the early persons of color that was in our movement. Anyway, Sally, can you name her? Not. Oh, okay. All right. You would be able to. Anyway, there's a number of people that are historic to the arts. Janet Foner is in this picture, who right now is developing a program for people to get off of psychiatric drugs. Okay, next. This is one of the early theater groups, and in fact has been successful and continues to be successful even now. They organized in 1985. They're now a full project that have gotten SAMHSA grants. They're a theater group that writes and performs original comedy and drama about the experience of being labeled with a mental illness. They seek to promote recovery and community change through creativity and art, and they do 20 shows a year in the East Coast. They're located in Connecticut. Okay, next. Sybil Noble is very well known. Actually, she was part probably of the demonstration that Sally talked about, where we had the chain of people at the APA convention. So she was a very early organizer, protester, but really she was became best known for her artwork. She's in St. Louis, Missouri. She does a lot with faces. She does a lot of what I call mad art. She was the first person that I know of to receive a Eli Lilly scholarship to attend art school. Her artwork is being exhibited in many local and national venues, and she's now selling her work. She's amazing, and she's just continues to do fantastic artwork. I'm not sure if she has a website for it. Next. This is Cookie Gant. She probably goes back into the 70s and 80s. She was one of our very first activists who also was an artist, called herself an artiste extraordinaire. She was a poet, a performance artist. She was quite of a character, is the way I could put it. She was an African-American lesbian and was one of the first people to speak out on both issues. And later she was in a wheelchair, where she had her wheelchair all covered in buttons and different things that she sold. So she was She died in 2003, and there's an award or a honor that's given to somebody in her name in the state of Michigan every year. Okay, next. In the 1990s, we have a lot more individuals who are becoming known for their arts. There was an arts guidebook that was published. Childhood trauma is beginning to be addressed through art and confronting stigma and demonstrations, discrimination, and there were a lot of exhibits specific to the issue of stigma that included the artwork. And I'm going to have to rush through, I think, a little bit more here. You'll have to stop me, Peter, when you need to. Okay, next. I'll maybe rush through. We did a guidebook. Sally and Howie and Sybil did one called Reaching Across. We followed in 2000 with receiving funds from the Center for Mental Health Services that we called Reaching Across with the Arts, which was a how-to on how to do many of the different types of arts, types of experiences. Okay, next. David Kine is probably not very well known. He put out a zine for probably 20 years in Philadelphia. Comes with quite a little story. I can't exactly tell it, but he had a vision to start this zine or to write a book, and a psychiatrist told him that he would probably never be able to do that. He continues to work in Philadelphia in an organization called Coalition Ingenue. Okay? Next. This is one of the early arts projects that began in Chicago, Illinois, the Awakenings Project. Irene O'Neill and Robert London are the two founders of this program. Robert's goal was to do an literary review literary arts journal, which he put out for many years. Last I saw was 2012. It's a continuing successful organization that does exhibits all over the state of Illinois. Next. Pillars of Unrest is a project that has gone around the country into state hospitals. This is a pillar that was done in Fulton, Missouri. Its original name was Pillars of Unrest, and now it's called Pillars of Hope. Okay, next. I'll just kind of whip through the next one. You can continue, because I just kind of want to showcase the pictures at this point. I see that we're getting close to time. Next. Mark Davis, I think many of the people watching will know of or have seen some of Mark Davis's performances. He does an outrageous performance. This one was done in 2004, I believe, was the beginning. He calls his act Drag with a Tag. And even though he presents himself in outrageous costumes as misaltered states, he also does his act to educate and raise consciousness about being gay, living with HIV, mental health issues, and also suicide prevention. Next. This is Wambui Bahati. She performed at some of our alternatives conferences, specifically in Atlanta and also at N.A.P.S, at some of their conferences. She was a Broadway performer that later lost herself and created later a one-woman show called Balancing Act. I just recently found out, if you go to her website, that this is now available on YouTube, I believe, or that you can buy the Balancing Act as a DVD. So those of you that know her, if you don't know her, go to her website. She also wrote a book called You Don't Know Crazy, which we gave out in Delaware to all of our peer specialists. Excellent. Next. Sharon Wise is very well known, and last I knew she was going to Italy. It's hard to know where she's at. She does very, very prolific artwork, much on her culture, much on her own recovery through art, and she received a Voice Award in 2008. She also is known for her butterfly dance, and she will be at Alternatives this year. Next. Amy Smith is in Colorado. she's also very much still an activist in what we might call our movement. She's living in a very tiny town called Eckley near Denver, Colorado, or in Colorado, I should say. And she was asked by a therapist to write about, or to draw or paint or depict in art her trauma history. So the left picture is her with hands and two balls. It's sort of very elusive that she can't touch at a time when she calls this why. And I also see that there's chains around her arms that depict how she was feeling at that time. She's in Colorado. She's one of the people with myself that want to organize the 2016 Mad Arts Festival is what we hope to call it. Next. Jerome Lawrence is very well known. Please go to his website because his art is amazing. It's beautiful to look at. He's a writer. He's written 2 books, but he was noticed and became known by Rosalind Carter. And every year sells one of his paintings. The last one, I think, went for $21,000 at a a fundraiser for the Carter Center. So he gets a lot of support there. He continues to do his art, to sell his art, and to promote it in various ways. Definitely take a look at what he does. Okay, next. This is Mike Skinner, who puts out a newsletter, Surviving Spirit. He also was somebody that worked with us many, many years at Alternatives, helped to do the emceeing, played music, volunteered much of his time. He writes primarily on trauma or focuses on trauma. His newsletter, the purpose of which is to promote hope, healing, and help for those impacted by trauma, abuse, or mental health concerns. Much of his focus also is with men who have experienced trauma in his lives. You can see on this slide how to go to his website and also to access his newsletter. Next. Megan Cauley, for those of you that are on the West Coast, her work is amazing. Megan Cauley, on the left is her picture, painting, drawing of hugging form that I consider one of my favorites because it within it, you'd have to see it real closely. There are at least 6, you would probably say more, faces within her kind of fetalistic type person or fetus. Again, I don't know how to quite describe it. She's now selling this work. She says of her life, my life has been rather raw and hard to look at, but I have tried to make it into something that has beauty, and art has done that for me. She's working, I think, for an agency as a director of a peer agency, I believe. And her other picture is one of lotuses, which is coming out of the mud into light and beauty. And she has a whole series of lotuses. Next. The Creative Vision Factory is probably going to be one of the best-known art centers in the country, if it not already is, because of how much it has grown and integrated into the community. This picture is one of a mural that was done as part of the history of Wilmington when it was first settled, for which they got a $22,000 grant. They're working with many of the community agencies, including police. They have very high-profile artists. I'd like to mention some of them. I have a longer description of what they're doing. Again, you can find them on Facebook, and I believe they also have a webpage. Very, very exciting work, and I want to honor Michael Kalmbach. And it's also funded by the Department of Substance Abuse and Mental Health in Delaware. And I think my last slide, if I'm not mistaken, next is the cemetery projects, which I consider to be an art type project because they're a beautification project. And the whole concept started in Georgia when Larry Fricks and people with the Georgia Network found unmarked graves. 25,000 people were buried in unmarked graves at Central State Hospital. Actually, that was at that time called Milledgeville State Hospital, and was also the name of the community, so it was renamed. And that's a picture, a painting that was done by a consumer. I don't have her name, but of the now Gate 2, this beautiful project. And I know that Larry and Pat Deegan have been working, and I'm not sure the status of it, of a memorial that is going to be placed at Elizabeth State Hospital in Washington, D.C. On the left is a memorial monument that was just placed there, I believe, in the state of Maine, where they're doing another memorial to people that they actually couldn't find the names to, but have honored there as a memorial. Okay, next, I believe we're getting to the end. I believe that's my last slide. I'll just mention the last thing. I know that we're a little bit over time. Some of us are really thinking seriously of developing an arts festival in 2016. Please contact me if you're interested. I think it's doable, I think it's viable, and I think it's timely. And I'd like to say that I think the arts are one place that we can provide a place for community, for common ground, for not necessarily having to have a politics on mental health, but to make art the centerpiece of the world of people that have had and continue to face challenges with psychiatric histories and mental health issues. Okay, and I believe my last slide, I think trauma is another big thing that is becoming very prominent in terms of art, and there's a project that is being done by Nashville that focuses on trauma. This last slide is a picture of me, Henrietta. I do a performance. Henrietta is always scattered, confused, as she was in developing this PowerPoint, but here it is. I'm excited that Sally and I did it. I'm retired. There's my email. Please contact me. There's my phone number as well. And I'm on Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gayle. That was wonderful. And here are some resources. This PowerPoint will be on the I.N.A.P.S website within the next day or two, within the next few days. Rita, is that correct? Will it take a few days to get it on the website?
The way that it works, Peter, is the PowerPoint is embedded in the quiz, so they have to take the quiz first. Once they finish the quiz, then they have access.
Okay. So you heard the rules, and Rita had set up the rules. So please use your chat feature. We've got about 3 minutes. I know we've run over, but if there's any burning questions you have for either one of our presenters, please take and use the chat function and ask that question now.
And I just wanted to address one question came in about how Steve is. Steve is doing well, all things considered. He's certainly still got his wicked sense of humor. He does have some physical challenges that he's working through right now. But there is a get well card on our website if you could take a few minutes just to sign that and send him, all of your admiration for bringing this organization to where it is today. That would be great.
And just as a sidebar to what Rita said, I had the pleasure of seeing him this past Sunday. And while he is facing some challenges, he also does clearly have his spirit about him. He has this sense of comedy is still with him, and he's working through his challenges as best he can. It was very good to be face-to-face with Steve so that I knew myself how he was doing. And it certainly reassured me that he's on the road to recovery, as all of us are on the road to recovery. So without any further ado, I thank you all very much for participating. You know what the ground rules are. You need to get a hold of me. Get a hold of me. You need to get a hold of Rita. You can certainly get a hold of Rita. And I promise you all that we'll be back again. We'll have one more webinar before the end of the year. So stay tuned. Go to the I.N.A.P.S webpage, and they will let you know. And we're getting some very positive comments to our presenters for the great job that you did of presenting this very important and informational information that you brought to us. Very timely. every day to share their experience with us, which is very vast experience. Rita, any last comments?
No, amazing. Thank you so much, Sally. Thank you, Gayle. Really.
Yeah, Gayle and Sally, you really took and did a great job. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, everybody take care now.
Bye.